Thanks very much, Steve. Great to be here this afternoon, and thanks very much for inviting me there. I'm going to talk a little bit about biodiversity net gain, and I'm not sure that I'm going to be particularly insightful, having listened to a lot of the talks this morning. You all seem to be fairly in the same mode as ourselves in terms of wanting to incorporate nature into everything that you do. So, just by way of introduction, I'm Pat Roberts. I've just been introduced by Gillian there, and I'm very much in favour of the delivery of biodiversity net gain in Ireland. How many of you have heard of the concept of biodiversity net gain, by the way? So all of you, more or less. That's okay. So it's relatively new, and it's something that I think is a massively positive step in the road towards nature restoration. And what I found also is that a lot of our clients, we're an ecological consultancy. We do environmental impact assessment, ecological impact assessment for all sorts of developments, from housing to renewables to roads and what have you. But most of our clients now want to deliver biodiversity net gain if they're given the opportunity to do so. And they want to pay for it as well, which is great. And so that's a big change. And there are a few blocks to allowing them to go down that road, but that's what they want to do. Biodiversity net gain provides a mechanism for, I suppose, measuring impacts or measuring the gains to biodiversity that you might get. So it's a question of it's a method by which you can say, yes, we've done this for nature. From our experienced landscape professionals have a really key role to play in the delivery of BNG, especially on development sites. And I suppose that's why I'm here talking to you, and I think a lot of you are very much in the same manner. And I think really, I suppose, to even start out, collaboration between the landscape professionals and the ecologists and everybody else on the project team is really important from a very early stage. And again, that's not particularly insightful because that's what everybody's been saying since the start of this conference. I think so. So I think everybody knows that's the case. So just to give you a brief introduction, I'll just give you a brief description of BNG, the basics, and I'll fly through that because you've all put your hands up, so you probably have quite a reasonable understanding of what it is. I think it's really important to go through the SIEM good practice principles. SIEM is our professional body, and they in the UK have produced good practice principles, which I think are fundamental to ensuring that BNG is not actually greenwashing by another name, which is something I would be afraid of. I go through some of the advantages and some of the criticisms of biodiversity net gain and the requirements that I think are really fundamental to it being successful. And then after that, I'll go through a few opportunities, I suppose, and key points that I think are really important to talk about as well. So as not to hold things up, I can talk quite well, and I'll probably talk for too long if I'm left to do so. So keep an eye on me. Right, very briefly, biodiversity net gain is an approach to development and or land management that aims to leave the natural environment in a measurably better state than it was before. The key there is measurable, I think, has to be measurable, and that's really something that is the purpose of a metric, is to measure and to be able to demonstrate that there not only is there a gain that you can describe, there's something that business or people can measure and say, yes, we've achieved this or that. So that's one of the keys there, I suppose. And the other one is that it's to leave it better than it was before, which is that it comes to Roche's curve, where we're going in the wrong direction. It's no good to leave it flat. We've got to go in the right direction. So that's the kind of the message there. There's a simple graphic that I stole. So if it belongs to anybody else, you can. I'll quickly go over it. Essentially, it's not mine, but it shows it well. But basically, net loss from development, and then there's no net loss, which is the premise which most of us have been working on for all our careers, that you don't lose biodiversity. And now we're looking at the concept of net gain, or we'd like to see that happen. How is BNG measured? It's BNG is quantified using a matrix. Now there's about 3,000 matrices, I believe, in the world. So I've heard in my studies for trying to find one that works. The one that we've been using is one that's based in the UK, and people have probably heard of that. It's the Depler metric. It was designed for the UK. It wasn't designed for Ireland, but it can be used here as long as we're careful with how we use it, I think. And it's the only one really that we've come across that has got any sort of formal mandate anywhere. But really, I suppose it's one of those things that instead of sitting on our hands, we start somewhere and we use some method of quantification. So the matrix then calculates any loss of biodiversity units accruing from a particular development, and then mitigation is put in place that calculates the amount that we can put back, I suppose. So basically, you divide the site up into what an amount of biodiversity baseline units. You calculate the amount that's going to be lost as part of the development, and you then look at what's going to be put back and quantifies that with a matrix. It is not perfect. No matrix is perfect, but it gives that kind of quantification. As I said,
excuse me, could the slide be shared, please?
And we've been using that here to a large extent. There are other metrics available. Irish Water have one, and SSE Electricity, Nature Scotland developed one. So there's loads of them. But really, the concept here is I'm not too worried about which metric we use. We're talking about the concept of having a metric, which I think is very important. That's just an example of the Depler metric and what it looks like. It's an Excel-based system, and you can see you've got your on-site baseline, you've got your on-site post-development, which is essentially your loss. And you've got your off-site baseline if you need to do it off-site, and your off-site post-development. So basically, you've got a calculation of what you're losing and a calculation of what you're gaining. It's dependent on good ecological limits. It takes into account habitat size, condition, distinctiveness, strategic significance. It takes all those into account in the metric. I suppose it's really needs to be used by an ecologist in order for it to be correct. Requirements for successful BNG, in my opinion, this is only my opinion now, it must be used secondarily to the ecological impact assessment, EIA or AA, and must not contradict those assessments. That's your assessment of the impact on biodiversity. That's the assessment that I do that says, look, you're going to have a significant effect on this or that or the other. And really, this is not a substitute for that. This is really a way of comfort. That has to be the primary thing. This has to come second as a way of measuring it for the purposes of, I suppose, for the purposes of identifying losses and gains. Must be used as a tool to quantify losses and gains as opposed to an impact assessment. I just said that's fine. Must be applied in a standardized manner in line with the technical guidance documents which are provided.
Can I pause you 1 minute? I did try and type a message onto the thing, but I was coming up with gobbledygook. For the people online, we don't have the presentation on the computer that is zooming to you, which is why you cannot see the presentation. Hopefully you can hear Pat and hear what he is saying. But when I tried to type you a message, I was getting gobbledygook coming up. It wasn't typing the right letters. Carry on, Pat.
Thanks very much. So I hope you can all hear me. If you can, that's good. Sorry you can't see the wonderful photograph. Essentially, each decision must be taken and justified by expert opinion. You just can't have a matrix that is not justified, and each decision you make has to be kind of like, you have to know why you made that decision, why you put a certain figure against something. Must follow the mitigation hierarchy, which is the SAI and BNG code of practice. The mitigation hierarchy starts with avoid, minimize, mitigate, and I suppose basically you're minimizing your impact in the first place. And as with all ecological assessment, implementation will need to be regulated and audited to ensure that it's being applied appropriately. And I think that's something that we lack in probably globally, actually. certainly in this country, it's very, and in the UK, it's the ensuring that it actually gets applied and monitored correctly is a tricky stumbling block at the moment. So this is getting on to the bit that is relates, I suppose, to our experiences with working with landscapers, and we get on to the collaboration piece. And where do we start? Really, I think, and as this is a familiar theme, at the beginning is where we start. That essentially we want to be collaborating at the very inception of a project team. At the very, very beginning, we need to be part of that project team, ecologists, landscapers, and we need to start that chat, because that's a habitat map over there on the screen, and really we want to be working with the landscape as it stands, as I'm sure you do for nature-based solutions. We want to be looking where possible at starting with what we've got and conserving what we've got, and if we have to get rid of it, yeah, well, that's fine, but you have to have a very good reason for why that is, you know, and to have thought about it. I think, and it's much easier and better to keep things and enhance them than to lose them and replace them. And I think then once you've got throughout the design process, it's really important to work with the landscape team all the way through that, so that we can design something that works for everybody. Design considerations, I think habitat connectivity with the wider area, provision of unlit areas, treatment of water on site, and choice of species. Those are things we need to be looking at all the way through from the start to the finish of a development. And I think we've had some very, very successful collaborations with landscape architects when that happens. What often happens with us, and I'm sure it happens with you as landscape architects, you get handed a design and said, right, assess that. And then that becomes very tricky. You're trying to retrospectively fit things in, and it's much more difficult and much less effective. So collaboration at the start is one of the key points, I think, to talk about. Another key point is to understand each other. And again, from listening to the previous speakers, I think we are kind of moving that way. I've got two pictures up there. One which is an overgrown pond with some messy, untidy ecology next to it, and that's what I mean when I talk about biodiversity. You know, that's a jumble of species that is abounding with life, bramble and rank grasslands. It mightn't be a protected habitat, but nonetheless, that's probably biodiversity. That's the kind of biodiversity you get left in an abandoned site in urban areas. The kind of biodiversity that happens in the rural areas also. And if we look at our other, I apologise if that's one of your developments there now, and I don't mean it to be, somebody probably recognises where that is. But and using it as an example, nobody was pretending that was a biodiversity area. But you don't take out a tree line that's from the photograph on this photograph and replace it with a tree line like that and say that's biodiversity net gain. I believe that putting tree lines in your developments and all the green roofs and the green walls and the water features, the rain gardens, that's absolutely exactly 100% what we should be doing in the urban environment. Absolutely, all those things. And they're really, really welcome from the landscape designers and all the lads that I've worked with over the years, some of whom are in the room. I think that's exactly where we want to be going with that. But we can't pretend that it's that, because it's not. And that's one of the fundamental things between ecologists and landscape architects. And I suppose it's that level of understanding that we can do what we can within the confines of the requirements of our developments or whatever it is that we need to do. But we must come to a conclusion that in some cases, we're putting a high density housing project on a field. We're probably not going to get biodiversity net gain in on-site that. Another key point, this is a practical point. If you're trying to measure something, we set out our habitats on they're generally GIS shapefiles. And we measure the amount of loss of those habitats. If we're trying to work out biodiversity losses and gains, we need to have those. This is really, really technical, but the practical point that we need to have the landscape architects thinking from the start, right, Pat needs to know where his biodiversity is, how much biodiversity area is coming back. So we need to have shapefiles that correspond. So we need, rather than having a little bit here and a little bit there and all woven in with all your other CAD files, we need to have that calculation, people thinking in those lines at that stage when you're drawing up your landscape design. Simple, really, but it's not simple at the end when you're trying to pick apart a little piece here and a little piece there of habitats and what have you. So we really want to see that. And I know it's a very pedantic sort of a point, but I think it's something that would be very useful when something that takes our people a lot of time, or landscapers a lot of time to pick apart, to do the actual assessment. We need to be able to quantify what it is that the landscapers are putting back that constitutes biodiversity habitats, and we need to be able to measure those. So I suppose separate file layers for each habitat type created, and BNG files for linear and area-based habitats. So it's a practical point, but we can talk to you about that if we're working with you. But again, it works really well if you collaborate from the start, but it doesn't work particularly well if you've done your landscape design and we ask you for something at the end, or you ask us to do something at the end. It just highlights that need for collaboration. Very easy if you start off in that line. A key point as well is there's a brownfield site and a greenfield site. On a brownfield site, it's pretty blooming easy to do biodiversity net gain because you're starting from a low base. In lots of cases, now there might be bats and things like that in there involved as well, but nonetheless, it's much easier. A greenfield site, it's very difficult because generally you're going to be losing something. I mean, once again, I apologise if those were your sites. I think you probably were. There's probably people in here that recognise one or two spots there, but it's just to make that point. And that is very key. That's key actually, because if we are looking for biodiversity net gain, there's a certain amount that we could and should be doing on site, and that is as much as possible. We should be doing as much as possible on site to avoid the sensitive receptors and to enhance biodiversity within our developments. But we will come across sites, particularly in the greenfield, where we're not going to be able to do it on site. In which case, how are we going to do off-site? I think it'd be a great idea if we could get some strategic local authority green infrastructure and some way that biodiversity net gain that we can't deliver on site gets delivered off. And I believe that there is precedent in other jurisdictions where that works, where it gets essentially designed in a strategic manner, and a strategic large-scale manner by one particular group or authority, and gets paid for by people who need to use that resource. And I think that's an interesting way forward if we are to deliver BNG on site. Drivers for BNG, I think policy needs to be strengthened in the nature restoration plan, the county development plans, etc. And I think it possibly might be in this new nature restoration law and the nature restoration plan, which is coming down the line. I don't want to see it with a wishy-washy. This might happen. I want to see it as a firm objective of the plan. I think regulation and oversight of delivery and success is crucial. It ain't going to work. Nobody's going to buy into it if it's not regulated and overseen. And I don't know who's going to oversee it. I don't know who regulates it. And it's one of the things that bugs me about planning applications and about landscaping plans and about everything. Who looks at it? We all do these things, and they're all great. But do they always get implemented? And do they always get? They might get implemented, but they always get monitored for perpetuity. And you know, how do we? Who would fund it? And who funds the BNG if we have BNG? Who looks after it for years? Who makes sure it works? Who holds anybody accountable? That's something that's got to change. And I have ideas, but you know, it's difficult. Monitoring and maintenance of biodiversity. Sorry, that's the same thing as well. That's regulation and oversight. It all comes into it. I mean, and I just think we can do all the biodiversity management or design that we like, but these things require management in the long term, as do landscape designs. And if there's nobody there making sure it's okay on public lands, but on private lands, once it goes past, once it gets planning permission, may or may not happen, but nobody there really looking after that. More intellectual collaboration and understanding, working towards a common aim. I think you know, we're on the same page here. Well, I didn't know that we were before I came into the room. I knew we were with Roshi and that we worked with and the people that I worked with, but I didn't know that everybody was on the same line. But I think everybody's working towards a common goal here, or at least that's what it seems to me. And I kind of a final point. I do have one more slide, but I'll move on to it very quickly. Making biodiversity an asset rather than a liability. I think that's, and I don't think it's massively idealistic. We need biodiversity, but at the moment it's seen by most developers as a liability rather than an asset. And I believe that really has to change, and it can change when people actually need it for their financial reporting to show that they're sustainable. If there's a proper regulation, biodiversity will actually become an asset. And then once it becomes an asset, our worries are over because people will want to do it. And they already do want to do it, but they can't do it without the regulation because it becomes an asset. Anyway, my final slide, just our experience. Landscape architects generally want to work closely with ecologists. That's what we found. And they want to do it from an early stage, given the opportunity. So we just got to push ourselves a little bit further up the food chain, get there at the project inception. Early collaboration is key. Often a disconnect about what is meant by biodiversity. What we think is biodiversity is a messy old thing. And we need to really kind of just make sure that we chat to each other about that. Problems occur mainly when there's a lack of clear communication and not early engagement. That is the site there, by the way, in my final point. That's a calcareous grassland in the making. And it was developed by a landscape architect, who I don't see in the room here today, but it was to bring the surrounding habitats into the existing environment. So we wanted to make sure that happened. So we kept the soil from the site itself. We spread it very, very thinly on a limestone substrate, and we did a seed collection from the neighbouring grassland in a public event. And now we're using a university to monitor the results. Well, we're helping them, and we're undergraduate projects are going through it. But my point is that was developed by a good landscape architect, in my opinion, who wanted to do something good for the ecology and bring the ecology of the area and the surrounding area into what you can see as a very, very urban environment. And what we'd like to see is from this is an experiment. See, well, actually, if we can do this here and it looks good, you know, and it could look good, then could we bring that into, because that's a very easy thing to do if you doesn't take a lot of maintenance, if it looks good, if we can get. So that's one of my most positive experiences working with you both. Listen, thank you very much for that. And